Time to go to work. Let's get to this contracts class. Turn to page 1 of the PDF document, and it talks about introduction and watching video number 1, the introduction to the course and the principles we're going to cover today in this particular 3-hour contracts class. And if you're on page 1, it should talk about the course being in 3 parts. Now, I do talk about the rule of 3 frequently. Every mom learned in mom school. I'm going to count to 3, and 3 strikes and you're out, and 3 stooges, and Aladdin got 3 wishes, the Goldilocks and the 3 bears. Social scientists actually call this the Goldilocks principle. And in real estate, we're frequently recommended if you're going to give someone an attorney, give them 3 attorneys, 3 home inspection companies, 3 lenders. Let them have a choice of their service providers. And so talk to your broker about that particular issue. They may have an attorney that they really like and say, look, we don't need to refer 3. This attorney is really good, or this home warranty company is on top of everything and we've used them a lot. This is who we recommend. So a broker can make a recommendation as long as it's based on a business principle, not somebody brought donuts to the meeting. So let's get into the introduction. The 3 parts of the class, we're going to talk about contracts, and I mentioned earlier in the first video, we're going to talk about some fundamentals, and that's what's going to happen here. Second, the law has several statutes that affect your duties and responsibilities as the licensee. We're going to talk about the law in part number 2, and we're going to get to that. But here's the deal. Bottom line, if you're not able to write a binding, valid contract, you won't get any families to the finish line. And we don't get paid for efforts, we get paid for results. If you don't get the final result of a closed transaction, the family doesn't get to move in or move out, and you don't get paid. So all the work that happens up to that final exchanging of the keys, so to speak, that's all. It can all come apart if the contract is not written well and every party doesn't understand what their obligations and commitments are. And that's the function of the contract, to communicate their obligations and their commitments and what is actually expected of them during this transaction. And here's a point on page 1. Point to ponder, it's called. Does passing the exam make you a SME? And as you know, a SME is a subject matter expert under the law. And typically, the courts would say, well, you had to pass an exam to get a license issued by the state, and because you had to pass an exam, that does make you a subject matter expert. Now, you're not an attorney, and we talked earlier about Article 13 of the Code of Ethics says do not act like an attorney unless you are one, but you're still supposed to be able to explain the contracts, and you make sure you explain it. Don't advise them. Don't give them legal advice. Advice, guidance, and counsel is what they come to us for, but when that advice starts getting into legal advice, now we've crossed the line, and you've got to be sensitive to where the line is. Here's the deal. Under the law, if the consumer justifiably relies on your advice to their harm, they can sue you. It's called the lawsuit chapter, and it's 645-257. We'll talk about it later on in the class. But just so you know, there are laws that specifically address these contract issues and these liability issues on the part of an agent or broker or even a client. From Wikipedia, a subject matter expert is a person who's accumulated great knowledge in a particular field or topic, and this level of knowledge is demonstrated by the person's degree, licensure, and or 3 years of professional experience with the subject. You are a professional because you get paid. An amateur does something for the love of the sport or for the love of the activity. They're not looking for a paycheck, but a professional gets compensated for what they do in some form of payment. So you are a professional, you're a subject matter expert, you passed the test. That's the way the courts are going to look at you. And what advice, guidance, and counsel did you give them? And did they follow your advice, guidance, and counsel? And if it's to their harm, now you have some liability. By the way, emotional distress is considered actual damages, so we'll talk about that when we get to it. But so first, contracts, second, the law, and third, the actual listing. This is a contracts class, and it's contracts law and the listing presentation. And the listing presentation needs to have a complete explanation of what are the seller's commitments and obligations in clear and understandable language in the listing agreement. So we're going to include not only the listing contract, but we'll talk about the duties owed somewhat because the law talks about the duties you owe under duties owed, especially the second hour. We're going to get into that. And here's the challenge. 35% of buyers approximately are going to be first-time buyers. They've never bought a house before, which means 35% of your sellers, this is going to be the first house they've ever sold. They really don't understand how this process works. They're really in the dark. They're expecting you to give them a preview in your presentation. Here's what's going to happen, and here's the order it's going to happen. How well do you meet their expectations? And I say this in every class, and it's an important concept to remember, especially in a contracts class. All hurt comes from violated expectations. And the reality is the seller doesn't really know what to expect. So they're looking for you to be their guide, their Yoda or their Dumbledore, so to speak. They're looking for you to be their guide to walk them through this process in a way that makes sense to them. So that's what we're concerned with in hour number 3. We're going to get into the listing, and here's a point to ponder. It's called bracing. I've got some bad news for you. And I mean, it's so bad you might not want to sell your house after all this. You might not want to buy a house through me after all this. I got some really bad news for you. You tell them it's really bad, and they're thinking, well, how bad is it? Give it to me. Do you want it straight? Yeah, I want it straight. How straight do you want it? I give it to me. I can handle it. When they're ready for something really severe, and when you tell them what the real world is, all of a sudden it's not quite as severe as they were thinking. In the absence of information, people default to the worst case scenario. In the absence of information, people default to the worst case scenario. And bracing does a very important function in building trust. When you tell them you have bad news and you tell them what it is, then they realize this guy does know what to do and when to do it and how to keep me out of trouble. He is my guide, and I actually do need a guide. So, what do they know about the marketing process? When you take the listing, what happens next? What does MLS really mean? What does it mean to be on the market through a medium that's going to be accessed by all kinds of social media platforms? People are going to be scraping the MLS for information about their home. Zillow, Trulia, Homes.com, Realtor.com. There's all these different places. Once they put their house on the market, the world is at their doorstep in their house. And then that's the marketing process. What about when an offer comes in? What about when the offer is accepted? So we have 3 phases: putting it on the market, getting an offer, and getting the offer accepted and buttoned up. And then what happens after that? What is the process once we've accepted an offer? So the process is called before, during, and after. Before we list the house, what happens? During the listing period, what happens? And after the listing is sold and closed, are our obligations all met? Are we done with this particular seller? And obviously, if you're building a referral business, the answer is absolutely no. I'm not done with this seller yet. In fact, I'm never done with the seller. There's no such thing as a past client. They're all clients. So those are just some opening thoughts. Those are all on page 1 of your PDF. If you have any questions about that, you can either send me an email or send me a text or call me up, and I'll try to answer them for you. It's part of what you're paying for as a resource to be able to get a hold of me. But if you're going to call me on this, have the outline in front of you when you call me, and have your questions specific, and I'll do my best to get them answered. That's part 1 video, actually video number 2, because there's an introduction first.